So as you can see before you, I've done a little bit more work on the modelling for this scene. We have the head, the scarf, the snake and the body, all which we created previously, but I've also added in these branches and started to play around with the whole composition of the scene. I've also added in some basic lighting, and this is all just to help me get a feel for where things should go, what's going to be rendered, what's not going to be rendered, because that's quite important when it comes to texturing. For example, if we're looking from here, if this is where we're going to render, there's no point spending lots of time texturing the back of him because that's just never going to be seen. So lots of things like that we need to start thinking about before we start UVing and texturing. If we just click on some of these branches, you'll see these are just very basic shapes. Just started off with a cube, extruded it, formed the shape, and then just added a bevel around the edges just to sharpen those off. If I just disable smooth mesh, you can see there, that's the low resolution proxy. And what I've also done is just added in some extra divisions, again like we were saying previously when we were working on the torso. We want these quads to be almost a uniform shape, so when it comes to sculpting, the sculpting is more uniform as well. So I've tried to do that with these branches here, just adding in these extra subdivisions. But I did that towards the end when I was happy with the overall shape, just adding in those as a final touch. So here we have the scene. Let's just go back to our perspective view, just so we can see. So as you can see, I've just got a basic spotlight just shining from the bottom. The lighting may change towards the end, I'm not sure, but I'm just playing around with ideas for now. Got the camera. As you can see, I've just put in some of these. Now I want these further back because these are eventually, as you can see, I've got depth of field on in this scene here, just to blur out those in the background because they're going to be in the distance. So enough talking about that. Let's get rid of that grid. Right, on to the subject of these next videos, and that's going to be applying UVs. And again, these are very basic shapes, so it shouldn't take too long to add UVs to these. I'm just going to focus on the main character for now, and the snake. The branches, again, they're quite easy to UV, so if you're not sure, look at the models in the next scene and just see how I've laid out the UVs for you for that. But let's just open this scene. Let's click on, select the head, and let's go to UV editor. So here's the UV editor, and as you can see, the UVs aren't very good, and this is because we've just been pulling around that model. If you remember, it started off as a cube, so it'll have had those UVs, and then we cut it in half, mirrored it, adjusted it. So basically the UVs are all completely broken. I'm just going to start off. I'm just going to hold Shift, right mouse button, mapping, planar map down the Z-axis. So that's just going to map directly from the front, like so. Go back into our UV editor, we can see the head here. And that's just going to give us a good starting point. So let's just isolate this. Now previously I said that we know that we're only going to be rendering this from the front, so there's no point in spending lots of time messing around with the back of the model. So to add to that, we can also place our texture seams at the back of the model too. So we need this the projections are from the front, so if we texture this from the front now, the texture will also come through straight onto the back of the model. And it will also stretch around the side of the model. So now we just need to open this up so that we can texture all of it a bit more evenly. And this also goes for the sculpting as well. So what I'm going to do is just use our four corners. We'll keep that seam there, otherwise the back's just going to be completely detached. Let's deselect those there. So we've got sort of even type selection around there, and this is going to dictate where our points, our edges are going to be cut. Just going to polygon, cut UV edges. you can see these bits that are highlighted in green. These are all the elements that are new in Maya 2016. So we can cut those edges. I'm just going to select those UVs and I'm going to right click on the Unfold Selected UVs tool. I'm just going to use Unfold 3D. Just move this over here. I'm just going to click Apply. As you can see, that's just unwrapped that very nicely and very quickly. Just going to turn that around just to line it up a bit, scale it down. Let's just position it roughly where we want, because ideally what I want from this texture page is to have the head, the scarf and the body all sort of on the same page. If you want, you could have the head on its own page, the scarf and the body on their own pages. It's entirely up to you. But as we can see now, this has unwrapped the UVs for me. And that looks pretty good. I'm quite happy to just move on with that. So let's close that down. Let's go back to here. So let's select the body next. I'm going to do exactly the same. Mapping, planar map Z. And then this time I'm just going to create a seam down the back. Let's just open up our UV editor again and just do the same. Cut UV edges. I'm just going to select the UVs, open up the options here and apply. Now I don't think you need to select the UVs. I think I'm just used to doing that with my particular workflow, because if you've got a model which is made up of lots of elements, you select the UVs on the part that you want to edit. Because this is a single model on its own, you can unfold the UVs anyway, it doesn't really matter. So let's just scale that down. Now we are going to tweak these UVs as we go, but for now, these are just giving us a good starting point. And again, let's just go through and let's select the scarf. And even though this is 3 different objects, I'm still just going to do the same. Planar map XYZ. And again, we can just do a split down the back of the scarf there, because the back of it is not going to be seen. Cut UV edges on that, and let's just go back down. And then for these scarf elements here, and looking at the model, this may be a bit thick, but then we may leave that thickness because it adds a bit more to the style of it. So let's see what's going to be seen the least. If we look from the front, so maybe we cut down this edge here. Now that's selected all the way around, so maybe we don't want to cut there because we want this to unfold. So again, we'll cut those UV edges. And the same with this one. Let's look from the front, so probably this back one here. Deselect those. So now let's just select that button, and that's unfolded those for me. Again, it's just really quick. So let's move these elements over here. So we know these are for the scarf. This is the top of the scarf. So I'm not sure which is the top or the bottom, but we can look at that shortly. That's it. Let's just move that up there. So we now have our 3 elements. Like so. So we've got the head, the scarf and the body, and they all have a basic set of UVs. If we come to the snake, let's just see what the UV is like on this. If you notice, because we use the helix, the UVs are already laid out in quite a nice way. It's quite flat, quite uniform. So for this, we don't need to add a new projection. What we can probably do is use these UVs as they are, perhaps we just make use of the full page. So we'll scale this up like so, and then we have these elements here which are the caps. Move these over. Now they don't need to be as big because they are just the caps and they're really tiny, and one of them is hidden anyway. But what that means is we can make better use of the full texture page, so the actual snake takes up a lot more here and the caps are smaller. So I mean, it depends what you're going to do when it comes to texturing, because this will distort the texture, but if you're just baking it from ZBrush, it doesn't really matter because it will bake it correctly. So let's just say we're at a stage now. We've got the snake, we've got the body, we've got the scarf, and we've got the head. They all have really basic UVs on them. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pause the video here, and then we'll pick up in the next video, and we'll just start tweaking the UVs, laying out our texture pages, and just seeing how they look, well, when a texture is applied to the model. So we're just carrying on with the UVs. Let's go back to our UV editor, and let's just make this a little bit smaller. I mean, as you can, before I do shrink it, as you can see, there's lots of new elements that have been added in to help you tweak and edit your UVs. All sorts, from cutting to sewing to pinning and freezing to smearing. So there's lots of things there. But for this particular model, we don't need to worry about those at this stage. So I know I want these three elements to be on the same texture page. So what I'm going to do is click on this button here, which will display a texture. And this is built in. And what this will allow us to do is just see how distorted the texture is on the model. Now for the head, yes, we have these. The grids aren't exactly perfectly square, but for a spherical model like this, you wouldn't expect them to be. You know, we've got little waves here and there, but that's not a big issue. I'm not too concerned about that. Like I said with the snake, we need to make the best use of the texture space, and if we're baking from ZBrush anyway, it doesn't really matter because the texture will just come through looking correct. So the head is fine for now. The scarf, again, as you can see here, they're nice evenly spaced squares. These areas of the scarf here and here, we probably need to adjust those just to make better use of them. But to be honest, I'm looking at the shape of the UVs here, and we do need to tweak those and adjust them as well. Now the body does need a bit of tweaking. As you can see, the squares are quite distorted, they're almost squashed. So what we can do now is let's just adjust that by just scaling these UVs down. Let's just make that a bit bigger just so we can see. In fact, I'm just going to isolate that just so we can see them a little bit better. So that's much better. Let's just scale that in a little bit. So that's a bit more even. Let's just move that out of the way. So again, the scarf was fine, but I wasn't sure which way was up or down. So if I move this up like so, yeah, that's the right way around. We can also start to think about where these are going to go on the page. So let's maybe put the scarf at the top there. The head, make that a little bit bigger. And while you're doing this, you also need to be thinking about which areas of the model are going to need the most detail. Because obviously if you want finer detail, like we're going to need some finer details on the head, so maybe that needs a bit more space. So the body, let's just bring this down here. Now the body, we can be a little bit more flexible. I mean, we want it to fit in there. Let's just turn off this for a second. So I'm quite happy to just scale this in a little bit. Again, the beauty of baking the maps across is they will come across correctly even if your UVs aren't, you know, aren't proportionally perfect. So we can get away with doing things like that, especially for the his body there. And then finally we just need to bring these in. Let's just scale that down. And ideally, we can see the squares on the scarf here. We want these here to match those too. Just in case if we add sort of a fabric detail onto the scarf here, we want it to be the same size on the scarf here. We don't want this area to have massive sort of folds of cotton, or, you know, whereas the one on here is smaller because it'll just look odd. So even though we maybe think, well, we want this to have a bigger space on the texture page, we still do need it to be roughly the same size as up here. Now, as long as it's the same size, I'm not too concerned. I do need to level some of these off. Just make that a bit bigger. So that's roughly how I want my UVs to be laid out. Now, let's just turn that off. Now, there are issues. I mean, this is clearly overlapping here. So now we need to start thinking, okay, what can we sacrifice? What can we squash? What can we stretch? And again, this comes down to what is going to be seen. From the front, you're not going to see the back of his head, and this area here at the sides, they're not going to be seen very much either. So what we can maybe do is, let's just move this over. Let's just move that over one grid square just so we can see what we're doing. We could maybe say, well, the back of the head isn't going to be seen very much, so let's just squash that down and claim back a bit of that texture space. We can do the same with the sides of the head, so let's just squash that in, because towards the back of the head you're not going to see that either. Squash that in there. So let's move this back over, and you can see that's claimed a bit more space back. So we could use that now to make the head bigger, just a touch bigger. We move this over like so. You know, we could do little cheats like that just to make everything fit on. Like I say, if you're going to have the head on its own texture page, then this is all irrelevant, but this is just, I wanted to save some texture space, so I wanted these three elements all on the same page. So from here, it's just a case of tweaking these UVs to get a nice layout. One other thing we need to change, open up the attribute editor, and that is the way that smooth mesh is affecting these elements. So if we go to our smooth mesh here, we can see that it's using the global subdivision method, which is the open subdiv Catmull Clark, which is absolutely fine. So we need to come down to the open subdiv controls, and we need to adjust some of these just to play around with the border edges really. At the moment some of them are quite angular, so as you can see, if we set the UV boundary smoothing to none, everything goes back to as if it's not been smoothed. Setting it to preserve edges and corners, you'll notice that rounded that area off there. So when this model gets smoothed in ZBrush, the UVs will be smoothed as well. So we need to sort of try and represent that in this. Preserve edges, if you notice, just smooth that edge off even more there. So that's pretty much what we're looking for. So we just want to smooth the edges of those UVs. So let's go to the scarf and do the same. Preserve edges, and if you see there, if you watch this bit of the scarf looks a bit messy. We set it to none. you see how it was previously, it's quite angular, there's some bits overlapping. Just by setting that to preserve edges, like so, it's opened it up and it's smoothed it out. Now it's still not perfect because we want this to be a little bit more uniform in shape for when we're baking our details across. But all we need to do now is just go in like so, maybe use these align tools, just to line that up like so. We could maybe match these up, just using the align tools just to go in, just tidy up some of these edges, just making it a bit more uniform, which when we come to bake our textures will just help them come across in a much better way. You know, and then just select the edges there and just square those off too. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to leave this lovely scene, and I'm just going to play around with the UVs a little bit more, and then we'll just pick it up in the next video and start preparing to export to ZBrush. Welcome back. So all I've done since the last video is just tidied up the UVs a little bit, and I've also UV'd the branches. Now looking at the scene now, it looks exactly the same as it did when we started UVing before, which is absolutely fine. But what we're looking for now is the stuff underneath the surface, those UVs all laid out and ready to be painted on and played around with. If we go into this scene here, what you see is I've just baked these branches together just to give me, again, a rough idea of the composition. They're not going to be the ones that I'm actually going to use. If we go to our UV editor, you'll see that these haven't had any UVing on them just yet. What I've done is created 3 variations of the branches, which you can see here, and I've put all those on the same UV page. Now it was important just to do one branch initially and UV it, and then I tweaked that and adjusted it to create these variations, and that just meant that the UVs were already done. They just needed a little bit of tweaking to adjust them to the new shapes. But what I have there is 3 branches that I can sculpt in ZBrush, then bring back into Maya, and then we've got a little bit of variation in the scene. If I just look here, we just select the body, we've got the head, the scarf, and the body there. And as I said before, I've just cleaned up the scarf, made it a lot more uniform and rigid with the shape, and that's just going to help when we're baking out the textures later. The head's a little bit bigger, and the scarf's at the top, and the body, they've all been tweaked and adjusted. Yes, there are elements of this page where there's texture space which needs to be used, and if you're going to texture the eyes, you could put the eyes on here as well. The stitches, if you want to go in and texture those, you could add those on here too. And there may be some other elements of this scene that you want to add. You could just squeeze it all into this texture page. But as this is an illustration, I'm not too concerned about wasting texture space. It's not like it's a real-time or a game asset where every pixel counts. So that's absolutely fine for what we're going to be using it for. So let's just, before I just skip on, just have another look at so the snake UVs, again, just tidied those up using the align tools just to make them a little bit more even, but they've not changed much since the previous video. So there, we're at a stage now where we are pretty much thinking, right, the models are done, well, the base models are done, we've added UV, so let's get those into ZBrush. And all I'm going to do now is basically, if we take the body as an example, let's just isolate those. If we turn off smooth mesh, you can see that it looks very angular. Ideally what we want to do, well, if I just go to the UVs as well. So the UVs are still quite angular, and yes, we could export this, take it into ZBrush, and use, when we apply subdivisions, use the smooth UV tool. But I find with ZBrush the UVs actually contract as well. It doesn't sort of smooth the UVs, in a similar way to Maya. And at this stage in the project, I'm not sure whether I'm going to use these base meshes and then export just the texture data from ZBrush, or whether I'm going to export the models from ZBrush as well and just use everything there and replace these. So I want to give myself a little bit of flexibility. Now it may be that somebody else is working on the models and then on your project, and somebody else is working on the textures. So if that's the issue, you know, then maybe you do have to stick with their base models. So if you want to try and keep the UVs, what we want to do is bake in a subdivision before we export. And all I'm going to do is just go to Mesh, Smooth, and ideally we want the UVs, let's just select the head for now. We want the UVs to remain the same as they are here. So it's a good idea when baking this, let's just open up the attribute editor as well. Just running out of a bit of space here. If you remember before, we adjusted the open subdiv controls, which controlled how the UVs were smoothed. I think we had it set to preserve edges previously, which just smoothed those out like so. But you may want to just keep that angular bit there. It's completely up to you. But basically, the point I'm trying to get across is the settings here, you also need to add in to your smooth tools here. So basically, vertex boundary, sharp edges and corners, UV boundary, preserve edges and corners too. So when this smooths your model, it's going to match the options you've got in here. Now we could just add one subdivision, we could add two, it's entirely up to you. But if I just add one in, you can see it's just retained the smoothness of the UV boundary. And I can turn off smooth mesh, as you can see, if I just press 3. So when we take this into ZBrush and apply a further subdivision, it's not going to have that much effect on the UVs here, because there's quite a lot of geometry, so there's not a lot of it to relax, if you sort of get what I mean. I mean, you may have a different approach to this, but this is just what I like doing, just to give me more flexibility. So now we've done the head, we can just go in and apply the same to the body and the scarf. So there, we've got those models. And then all we need to do now is just export those as an OBJ, and then we can start bringing those models into ZBrush and then start investigating sculpting. So that's it for Maya for now. Once you get to this stage, like I say, export your models, and then what we'll do in the next video is bring those into ZBrush, and start sculpting in those details.